She was strapped down, her final meal chosen, and the clock ticking toward lethal injection. Melissa Lucio, the first Latina woman sentenced to death in Texas, had just 48 hours to live. Guards were preparing the chamber. Her children were sobbing on the other side of the glass. The world thought this was the end, but then something happened that no one saw coming. This is the story of a woman branded a child killer, convicted of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, and the jaw-dropping twist that unfolded just moments before her scheduled execution. Did Melissa Lucio murder her own child? Or was she railroaded by a justice system hungry for a conviction? You're about to find out. Let's go back to where it all began. Melissa Lucio was born in Texas in 1969, one of 9 children crammed into a rundown home where food was scarce and fear was constant. Her father was violent, often drunk, and beat her regularly. At times, she was locked in closets, denied meals, or left to care for her younger siblings while her mother worked long hours at low-paying jobs. There were nights Melissa went to bed without eating, and mornings she woke to the sound of screaming, or worse. By the time she was a teenager, she had already endured years of sexual abuse from a relative, abuse that went unreported and untreated. She turned to drugs to numb the pain, ran with older men, and dropped out of school early. Her relationships mirrored the chaos she was raised in, violent, unstable, and rooted in survival. By her early 20s, Melissa was deep in a cycle of domestic abuse, addiction, and crushing poverty with children of her own to protect. She married young, barely out of her teens, and began having children almost immediately, one after the other. By the time she reached her early 30s, Melissa had given birth to 14 children, all while juggling toxic relationships, eviction notices, and poverty so severe that some nights her kids slept on bare floors or shared one meal between them. The family's homes were often windowless shacks or roach-infested apartments in the poorest corners of South Texas. Child Protective Services made regular visits, but nothing ever changed. Her older children were forced to raise the younger ones while Melissa worked odd jobs or disappeared with abusive partners. Chaos was normal. Hunger was expected, and love in any stable form was almost impossible to find. In February 2007, tragedy struck. It was a quiet February afternoon in 2007 when Melissa's life and the life of her family was shattered beyond recognition. Inside their sweltering one-bedroom apartment in Harlingen, Texas, Melissa's 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, lay motionless on the floor. Her skin was mottled with bruises, her tiny arm was broken. There was swelling in her brain, injuries to her internal organs, and scratches across her face. Paramedics were called, but it was already too late. Neighbors heard the sirens. The children screamed. Melissa was seen pacing frantically, sobbing, unable to explain what had happened. By the time the ambulance pulled away, police officers had already started asking questions. Within hours, Melissa was handcuffed and hauled into an interrogation room. What followed was a relentless 7-hour psychological assault, one that would change everything. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and cold. Melissa hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She had just watched her baby taken away in an ambulance, and now she was surrounded by detectives who weren't interested in comforting her. They were interested in breaking her. For over 7 relentless hours, they fired question after question. They told her she was a bad mother. They told her they had proof she killed Mariah. They said her silence would mean a death sentence. She was grieving, confused, exhausted, and she started to crack. At one point, an officer leaned in and said, "If you just tell us you hit her, we can help you." Melissa, sobbing and barely coherent, whispered, "I guess I did it." That sentence sealed her fate. The prosecution clung to that moment like a smoking gun. They portrayed her as a drug-addicted, neglectful mother who snapped under pressure and savagely beat her daughter to death. The jury never saw the full interrogation footage. They never heard from experts on coercive tactics. And they didn't get to hear the story of Melissa's life leading up to that night. Melissa from the beginning insisted it was an accident. Her defense said that Mariah had fallen down a steep flight of stairs several days earlier, and out of fear that CPS would take away her children, Melissa didn't bring her to the hospital. Several medical experts later testified that Mariah's injuries were consistent with a fall, not with intentional abuse. But it didn't matter. In 2008, Melissa Lucio was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For over a decade, Melissa rotted away on Texas's death row alone in a cement cell no bigger than a parking space. Locked in for 23 hours a day with only her memories and nightmares to keep her company. No TV, no physical contact. Just the endless ticking of time and the sound of distant doors slamming shut. Outside, her legal team was in a war against the clock. They filed appeal after appeal, uncovering disturbing truths. Melissa's so-called confession had been violently coerced. There was no forensic evidence, none, that proved she abused her daughter. And worst of all, the jury had never heard from key medical experts who could have changed everything. But while lawyers fought with paperwork, Melissa fought to stay sane. Years passed, hope flickered, and then out of nowhere, the world began to notice. The Innocence Project launched a full-scale campaign. True crime documentaries exploded online, dissecting every crack in the case. Major networks picked up the story. TikTokers and podcasters rallied, and then the big names joined in. Kim Kardashian tweeted to her millions of followers, calling the case a miscarriage of justice. Several members of Congress issued formal letters to the governor demanding a halt to the execution. Social media ignited. Protests erupted outside the prison gates. Candlelight vigils burned through the night. Melissa Lucio's name became a national cry for justice and outrage. And then came 2022. The state of Texas set her execution date, April 27th. Melissa would become the first Latina woman executed by Texas in modern history. She was moved to a holding cell. She wrote goodbye letters. She selected her final meal. Her family began preparing to witness her death. But behind the scenes, something was shifting. April 25th, 2022. Just 2 days before her execution, Melissa Lucio sat alone in a dimly lit holding cell, her hands trembling as she scribbled goodbye letters to her children, trying to squeeze decades of love into a few final sentences. She had been fasting for days, praying endlessly, her voice hoarse from whispering the same desperate pleas over and over again. Outside, chaos was building. Candlelight flickered in the wind as hundreds of supporters gathered outside the prison, some sobbing, some shouting through megaphones. "Free Melissa!" they cried. "Justice for Mariah!" The media swarmed like vultures, broadcasting every breath of the countdown. Helicopters hovered overhead. National news anchors called it one of the most controversial executions in modern U.S. history. Inside the courthouse, her attorneys were in full-blown panic mode, racing against the clock, filing emergency motions and bombarding the Texas Board of Pardons with last-ditch pleas. They had hours. Not days, hours. And then just as the clock was about to strike midnight, everything changed. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay of execution. Why? Because new evidence suggested Melissa may have been wrongfully convicted. Multiple forensic experts claimed the medical evidence used to convict her was outdated or flat out wrong. Even some jurors who had once voted for the death penalty came forward saying they felt misled. The court ordered a full review. When the news finally reached her, Melissa collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her body shook with disbelief. Guards who had seen it all before looked away, unsure how to process the raw eruption of emotion. She wailed so loudly the sound echoed down the hallway. She wasn't going to die. Not tonight. Not yet. The execution chamber would remain silent, at least for now. Melissa Lucio is still alive today. Her case tangled in a high-stakes legal limbo. Her supporters aren't just fighting for her freedom. They're fighting to prove that the system put an innocent woman on death row based on fear, bias, and a confession squeezed out in the darkest hours of her life. They say her case is the very definition of a wrongful conviction. Meanwhile, prosecutors dig in, insisting justice was served, painting her as a guilty woman whose execution was simply delayed. But here's what no one can deny. Melissa Lucio came within hours, minutes of death, strapped down and ready for a lethal injection, for a crime that may have never even happened. She has become the face of everything that can go wrong inside the American justice system. A mother, a survivor, a scapegoat, a name etched into the fight against the death penalty. And for Melissa, those final 24 hours weren't the end. They were the beginning of a storm the world couldn't ignore. Subscribe to Death Row Stories for more shocking cases, final day countdowns, and the real stories behind the world's most haunting executions. New videos every week.